Fear only works as long as everyone stays silent, but silence broke the night Malik Johnson stepped into the cage. What followed was chaos, revelation, and the kind of ending that forces you to question who truly holds power. Stay until the final moment, and while you do, tap like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your reactions and where you're watching the story unfold. The gray walls of Coldwater State Prison loomed like a fortress, built not just of concrete but of despair, holding men who had been stripped of their freedom and dignity, yet within that cold machine there walked someone who would not bend so easily. His name was Malik Johnson, a black man in his early 30s, strong in build but stronger in spirit, a man who had grown up fighting injustice long before the state shackled him. From the moment Malik stepped into the yard, his presence carried weight not because he boasted or raised his voice, but because he carried himself with quiet dignity, the kind that bullies despised. Among the crowd of hardened faces, one man's eyes lit up with malicious delight. Ethan Miller, a white inmate who ruled the block with arrogance and cruelty. Ethan strutted through the yard with his crew behind him, men who laughed at his every insult and treated his word as law. He had made a name for himself by breaking others down, especially targeting those who looked different, those he could belittle to inflate his hollow sense of power. To Ethan, Malik was a prize, a tall black newcomer who didn't flinch when the gate slammed shut, who didn't lower his gaze when surrounded by hostility. Ethan couldn't stand the sight of a man who wouldn't shrink. He swaggered over, sneering loudly enough for everyone to hear, because humiliating someone in private was never enough for him. He craved an audience. "Look at this one," Ethan barked, circling Malik like a wolf testing his prey. "Fresh meat. Welcome to my kingdom, boy. You eat when I tell you, you move when I tell you, and if I say crawl, you get down on your knees. That's how this works." His words dripped with venom, and the laughter of his crew rang out across the yard, echoing against the walls. Other inmates stopped to watch, some with pity in their eyes, others eager for the entertainment of another man's humiliation. Malik said nothing at first, his calm gaze locked on Ethan's pale, grinning face. That silence was louder than words, and it unsettled Ethan. He wanted fear, trembling, or at the very least, a muttered acknowledgement of his authority. Instead, Malik simply stood, tall and unshaken, his dark eyes betraying nothing but patience. Ethan's smirk wavered. He stepped closer, shoving Malik hard in the chest, making the crowd roar with laughter. "What's the matter, boy? Cat got your tongue?" Ethan spat. "Don't you know who I am? I run this place, and I decide who lives easy and who suffers." He shoved again, harder this time, knocking the apple from Malik's hand. The fruit rolled across the gravel, a small thing, but the act carried a message. "You're nothing here." Malik bent down slowly, picked up the apple, and brushed it clean. Without breaking eye contact, he took a deliberate bite. That simple act silenced the yard for a beat. It wasn't anger, wasn't defiance, it was calm dismissal, as if Ethan's theatrics meant nothing. That calmness was unbearable to Ethan. "You think you're better than me?" Ethan snapped, his voice rising. "I said crawl," his men hooted, waiting for Malik to drop, to beg, to do something that confirmed Ethan's control. Malik chewed slowly, swallowed, and finally spoke, his voice deep and steady, carrying across the yard. "I don't bow to bullies," he said. "Respect is earned, not forced, and you don't look like a man who knows the difference." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some grinned, others gasped, and Ethan's face flushed red with rage. He wanted to strike Malik right there, to wipe that calm expression off his face, but he knew too many eyes were watching, and even a self-proclaimed king of the yard had to play by certain rules. He forced a laugh, though it came out strained, and slapped Malik's shoulder with a heavy hand. "Big talk for fresh blood," he said, his jaw tight. "We'll see how long that mouth lasts. Tonight, we'll make sure everyone learns what happens when a man forgets his place." With that, Ethan turned on his heel, barking orders to his crew as they strutted away, but not before glancing back with a glare that promised more to come. The yard slowly returned to its rhythm, but whispers trailed behind Malik as he walked to a corner bench, finishing his apple in silence. Some inmates looked at him with respect, others with pity, knowing he had just made himself a target. But Malik wasn't shaken. He had lived his entire life as a black man in a world that tried to strip him of worth. Coldwater was only another battlefield, and bullies like Ethan were nothing new. He sat quietly, breathing slow, his mind drifting briefly to his mother outside these walls. She was the reason he endured, the reason he promised himself he wouldn't break no matter what they threw at him. To Ethan, Malik was just another inmate to be crushed. That night, the yard still buzzed with whispers about Malik Johnson, the black inmate who had refused to kneel to Ethan Miller, the white self-proclaimed king of the block, and the story spread quickly through the cell tiers, each retelling exaggerating the calm way Malik had eaten his apple while Ethan raged like a child, denied his toy. And though the walls of Coldwater State Prison were designed to strip men of their identity, Malik's quiet defiance had made him stand out in a place where conformity was survival. Inside his cell, Malik sat on his bunk staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the distant echoes of laughter and curses bouncing down the corridor, and he thought of his mother who was struggling to pay rent on the outside, her health fading, her letters filled with encouragement even as she suffered, and he reminded himself that he could not allow the prison's cruelty to consume him, for he had endured worse on the streets where being a black man meant carrying a target on his back every day. Across the block, Ethan seethed, pacing his cell, humiliated that his authority had been challenged in front of so many, his pride demanding a spectacle to crush Malik before others began questioning his dominance, and so he whispered to his closest men through the bars, plotting how to make Malik suffer, speaking of midnight ambushes and staged fights that would remind everyone who really ruled the prison. The next morning, Malik walked calmly into the mess hall, the sound of trays clattering and the smell of overcooked beans filling the air. And as he sat down to eat, Ethan's men surrounded him, their sneers rehearsed, their insults sharp, but Malik's eyes never wavered, his posture upright, his silence louder than their jeers. One of them, a tall, lanky man named Carter, leaned down and whispered, "You embarrassed the wrong man, boy, and tonight you'll pay." But Malik simply looked at him and replied, "A man only pays when he owes, and I owe nothing to cowards." His voice steady, drawing stares from surrounding tables. Ethan entered the hall then, strutting like a rooster, his grin returning as he watched his men crowd Malik, and he expected Malik to flinch, to lash out, to give him an excuse, but instead Malik calmly finished his food, stood, and walked away, his back straight, leaving the threats hanging in the air unanswered, and that restraint cut deeper into Ethan's pride than any punch could have. The calmness of Malik was not weakness, it was discipline, and discipline is what scared bullies the most, because they thrived on reactions and chaos, and without them, their power crumbled. By midday, Ethan had rallied his men, whispering promises of favors and protection in exchange for help against Malik. But not everyone was eager, for some had seen the way Malik carried himself and recognized a strength they could not name, a strength that was not about fists but about spirit. In the exercise yard, Ethan confronted Malik again, stepping in front of him with arms crossed, his crew forming a circle around them, and he barked, "This is your last chance to show respect, boy. Kneel now or you'll never walk again." The inmates leaned forward, hungry for violence, but Malik did not move, his voice calm as he said, "Respect isn't something you take by force, Ethan. It's something you earn, and you've earned nothing but fear, and fear is not respect." The words cut through the noise, and a ripple of murmurs spread, some prisoners nodding, others whispering about the audacity of a man so new to speak such truths. And Ethan's face turned crimson, his fist tightening, but he knew striking Malik in broad daylight with guards watching would cost him, so instead he spat at Malik's feet and growled, "Tonight, you're done." Malik wiped his shoe slowly, eyes locked on Ethan, and then walked away without another word, his composure unbroken, leaving Ethan's threats hanging heavy in the air. The tension that had been building between Malik Johnson and Ethan Miller did not go unnoticed by the men who pulled the strings behind the walls of Coldwater State Prison, for in a place where power was currency and survival was entertainment, nothing happened without the knowledge of those who benefited from it. And at the top of that shadowy hierarchy stood Captain Richard Bradley, the white warden whose reputation for cruelty was whispered among the inmates and feared by even some of his guards. Bradley was not a man of principle, he was a man of profit. A man who had turned the prison into his private theater, where lives were wagered like poker chips and the suffering of black men like Malik fed his appetite for both money and dominance. The night after Malik had walked away from Ethan's circle without bowing, Bradley sat in his office with members of the Jensen family, wealthy white men with deep pockets and dirtier secrets, Men who controlled the underground gambling rings that thrived on the blood and pain of inmates forced into fights they had no choice but to endure. Bradley poured whiskey into a glass and leaned back, listening as the Jensen spoke of the commotion Malik had caused in the yard, how his refusal to kneel had made him an instant figure of fascination, and how wagers would soar if he were thrown into the ring against fighters with reputations for brutality. "A black man who doesn't bend," one of the Jensen brothers chuckled. "He'll either become a legend in that pit, or he'll die feeding our profits, and either way we win." Bradley smirked, swirling his drink, and replied, "He's already on borrowed time. Ethan Miller won't let him live long, and that arrogance of his will make the bets climb higher. But don't worry, I'll arrange the stage, and when it's done, no one will remember him." In the cell block, Malik sensed the storm tightening around him, for he saw how guards began watching him with new eyes, how whispers of an arrangement reached his ears, and though he kept his calm exterior, he knew that Bradley and Ethan were weaving something larger than personal humiliation, something tied to the corrupt machine that had trapped men before him. The next morning during inspection, Bradley himself appeared in the yard, a rare sight, his polished boots clicking against the pavement as he surveyed the men with cold detachment. But when his eyes fell on Malik, there was a gleam of something darker, as though he already knew Malik's fate and was savoring the anticipation. Ethan approached him afterward, smirking with false humility, and whispered just loudly enough for Malik to overhear, "Tonight, the Warden's got something special planned. Hope you've got prayers left, boy." Malik finished his meager breakfast slowly, refusing to give Ethan the satisfaction of a reaction. But inside, he understood the weight of those words. For this was no longer about prison yard intimidation. This was about survival against a system rigged to profit from his pain. That evening, 2 guards appeared at his cell with orders, their expressions blank as they shackled his wrists and led him down the corridor, past cells where inmates banged on the bars in anticipation, for they knew what it meant when a man was taken at dusk, with no explanation. Malik walked steadily, his steps echoing in the long hallway until they reached the steel doors that opened into the hidden fight pit beneath the prison chapel, a place lit by harsh yellow lamps and surrounded by jeering men who placed bets with crumpled bills and shouted odds as though they were at a carnival. Bradley stood at the center, arms folded, announcing the night's entertainment with the flair of a ringmaster, his voice booming as he spoke of strength, survival, and spectacle. Malik was shoved into the cage, the chains on his ankles clinking as the door slammed behind him, and across the pit Ethan appeared with a grin wide as a blade, lifting his arms to the cheers of the crowd. But Bradley raised a hand, signaling silence, and said, "This won't be a simple fight. Our guests tonight demand more, so we'll give them more. 8 men, 1 survivor, and the last man standing walks out alive. Place your bets, gentlemen, and may the best animal win." The roar of the crowd was deafening, the sound of greed drowning out humanity, and Malik stood there, his chest rising steadily, his eyes calm despite the chaos, knowing that this was the stage Bradley had prepared for his destruction. Ethan pointed at him through the cage, shouting insults, but Malik only adjusted his stance, centering himself the way his old teacher had taught him, remembering the words that had guided him since childhood. Control your breath, control your mind, and the body will follow. The hidden fight pit beneath Coldwater State Prison had been built for nights like this, for men like Warden, Bradley, and the Jensen family who thrived on turning blood into money. And as Malik Johnson stood shackled at the center, he understood that his calm defiance against Ethan Miller had carried him straight into a trap designed to either break his body or feed the greed of those in power. The stench of sweat and iron filled the air as inmates and corrupt guards pressed against the fences, their eyes shining with excitement, their voices rising with chants for violence. Malik's chains clinked with each step, the cold metal around his ankles meant to limit his movement, a cruel disadvantage that made him appear weak to the crowd. But inside his chest, his breath remained steady, his calmness a shield against the storm of hostility. Ethan Miller stood across the cage, smirking with cruel satisfaction, his arms raised to the roar of the crowd as he shouted, "This is my house, and tonight I'm going to teach everyone what happens when a black man forgets his place." The words cut like knives, each syllable dripping with hatred, but Malik did not flinch, his eyes fixed on Ethan as though weighing not his insults but the flaws in his stance, the tells in his arrogance. Warden Bradley, standing above like a king surveying gladiators, shouted to the gamblers, "Tonight is not about mercy. Tonight is about survival. 8 men enter, and only 1 will walk out alive. So place your bets and let the fight begin. The crowd erupted, fists pumping in the air, and the clang of the opening gate announced the first challenger. A towering inmate with a shaved head and tattoos carved into his skin. A man known only as Big Ray, whose size alone made lesser men tremble. Ethan's crew cheered, certain Malik would be crushed within minutes, and Bradley exchanged satisfied glances with the Jensens, their pockets already heavy with wagers placed against Malik. Big Ray charged with a roar, fists swinging like hammers, but Malik sidestepped, the chain around his ankle scraping against the floor, and with a swift turn he redirected Ray's momentum, sending the larger man crashing into the cage. Gasps rippled through the crowd, surprise painted on the faces of those who had underestimated him. Ethan's smile faltered, and Bradley narrowed his eyes, realizing Malik was not the easy prey they had promised. Another gate opened, and a second fighter stormed in, this one lean and fast, his fists flying in a flurry of jabs. But Malik's training in Kung Fu guided him with precision, his movements fluid, his strikes controlled, and within moments the second man crumpled to the ground, groaning as the crowd roared with both outrage and awe. Malik stood tall, chest heaving, but eyes steady, his calm presence unnerving those who had expected fear or desperation. Ethan spat at the ground, fury twisting his features as he shouted, "You won't last against me, boy. I'll break you myself when the time comes." Malik simply looked at him, saying nothing, but the silence itself was louder than any taunt, a reminder that Malik's strength was not just in his fists, but in his refusal to be broken. The third and fourth fighters entered together, brothers with matching scars, attacking in unison with wild ferocity, and for a moment the cage was chaos, fists and feet flying, chains clinking as Malik defended himself with disciplined precision, his body absorbing blows but never yielding, his counterstrike sharp and deliberate until both brothers fell to the ground, clutching their ribs and moaning in pain. Sweat dripped down Malik's face, blood trickling from a cut above his brow, but his eyes remained clear, his calm unshaken. The crowd was no longer united. Some still shouted for his death, while others began to cheer for him, drawn to the spectacle of a man refusing to bow even when the odds were stacked against him. Bradley's face darkened, for he could sense the shift in the atmosphere, the beginning of something he had not planned for, admiration. Malik's calm was transforming into defiance that inspired others, and that was dangerous in a place built on fear. He whispered harshly to the Jensens, "We must end this before he turns into a symbol." Ethan, desperate to reclaim the attention, demanded to be let in, but Bradley held him back for the finale, promising him the glory of finishing Malik once he had been softened by the others. The fifth fighter was a former boxing champion named Jack Hanley, once respected, now broken and desperate for favors from the Warden, and he stepped into the cage with heavy gloves and eyes filled with shame. He threw powerful punches, each one shaking Malik's frame, but Malik absorbed the blows, waiting, studying, until he found the opening and delivered a precise strike that sent Hanley to his knees. Malik caught his breath, chains rattling, body aching, but his spirit unyielding. The crowd's noise reached a fever pitch, bets flying, guards shouting, and still Malik stood. Then the gate opened for the sixth fighter, a wiry man with eyes that burned with hatred, a knife hidden in his palm, smuggled in by Bradley's orders to ensure Malik would not leave alive. The crowd gasped at the blade, gleaming in the harsh lights, but Bradley said nothing, his silence an unspoken command to let the murder unfold. Malik saw the weapon, his body tensing, but instead of fear, he felt clarity, the kind of focus born from years of surviving in a world that had always armed itself against him. The man lunged, slashing wildly, but Malik twisted, the chain scraping as he moved, and with a disarming strike, he sent the blade clattering to the floor before delivering a devastating kick that dropped the man cold. The arena erupted, half in outrage, half in exhilaration, and Ethan screamed from the sidelines, "He's mine, let me in, now!" The roar of the crowd still thundered in the hidden fight pit beneath Coldwater State Prison as Ethan Miller stepped into the cage, his pale grin wide and cruel, his fists clenched like he was ready to tear Malik Johnson apart. But before Bradley could signal the official start of their fight, a sharp voice cut through the chaos, a woman's voice that none of the inmates expected to hear in such a place, and the entire arena fell into a stunned hush as Anna Carter, the daughter of a state contractor who had come to watch the fights under the guise of a guest, rose from the gallery with her hand raised. Anna was white, privileged, and unlike anyone who normally wasted their nights in Bradley's bloody circus, yet she had been watching Malik from the moment he entered the cage, her blue eyes narrowing not with disgust but with fascination as he calmly dismantled every opponent thrown at him. She had grown up seeing how men like Bradley and families like the Jensens profited from cruelty, and though she had stayed silent before, something in Malik's defiance sparked a part of her that could no longer pretend to be entertained by injustice. 10,000 on the black man, she shouted, her voice echoing against the iron rafters, and a ripple of disbelief surged through the room. No one wagered on a man the system had already marked for death, but Anna's words landed like a challenge against the corruption itself. Bradley's smug expression flickered. The Jensens exchanged sharp looks, and Ethan froze for a heartbeat. Humiliated that a woman of his own class had publicly placed her faith in the very man he swore to break. Malik turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Anna's across the pit. And though he said nothing, a spark of acknowledgement passed between them, an unspoken recognition that she had just placed herself in his corner. The crowd erupted in a storm of mixed reactions, half jeering, half shouting admiration, for gamblers smelled opportunity, and those who had seen Malik's strength now rushed to place bets on him as well, their voices rising as the odds shifted dramatically. Bradley's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the railing as he hissed at a guard to cut the chains from Malik's ankles, pretending it was to make the fight fair, but in truth, knowing that if Malik fell now, no one could claim it was because of a handicap. Ethan growled, stepping closer to Malik as the guard removed the shackles, and he whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "That girl won't save you, boy. When I'm finished, you'll wish you had never walked into my yard." Malik said nothing, but his eyes did not waver, his breathing steady as his legs moved freely for the first time that night, his stance shifting into something fluid and controlled, the posture of a man ready to fight not just for survival but for dignity. The bell clanged and Ethan lunged with a roar, fists swinging wild with rage, but Malik's calm focus guided him like water flowing around stone. Each strike met with precision, each dodge a reminder that control mattered more than brute force. Ethan's punches grew sloppier, his breath harsher, and the crowd began to notice that the bully's fury was being dismantled piece by piece. Anna leaned forward, her voice cutting through the noise as she shouted, "Stay on your feet, Malik, you've already beaten him." Her words carried over the pit like fire, igniting cheers from inmates who had once cheered for Ethan but now found themselves drawn to the quiet dignity of the black man who refused to fall. Bradley's face twisted with frustration as he realized the momentum was shifting, the spectacle no longer under his control, and the Jensens muttered angrily, demanding that he step in before their profits turned to losses. But Bradley hesitated, knowing that to intervene too early would expose the corruption he hid behind layers of pretense, and so he clenched his jaw and watched as Malik met Ethan's rage with discipline. Ethan roared again, charging with his shoulder, but Malik redirected the force, sending him sprawling into the cage wall, the sound of bone hitting iron reverberating across the arena. The crowd gasped, gamblers shouted, and for the first time, Ethan's grin cracked into panic as he realized he was no longer in control. Malik advanced slowly, not rushing, his movements measured, his eyes locked on Ethan like a predator studying prey, and every step he took made the bully shrink further into desperation. Anna's fists clenched at her sides, her voice steady as she called out, "Don't let them break you, Malik. You're stronger than all of them." Ethan's crew shouted curses from the sidelines, but their leader was floundering, his punches wild, his confidence shattered, and Malik delivered a clean strike to his jaw that sent him collapsing to his knees. The silence that followed was louder than the roar had been, a silence born from shock, from disbelief that the black man who had been mocked and targeted had just humbled the prison's self-proclaimed king in front of everyone. Malik stood over Ethan, his chest heaving but his gaze calm, and he did not finish him with a brutal blow as many expected. Instead, he stepped back, allowing Ethan the humiliation of rising slowly, beaten not by savagery but by discipline. That restraint spoke louder than violence, and the crowd erupted again, this time in chants for Malik, their voices shaking the very foundations of the corrupt spectacle. Bradley slammed his fist on the railing, his voice cutting through the noise as he declared, "Enough, this fight is over." But the gamblers jeered, demanding more, demanding that the show continue. And in their cries, Malik realized something powerful had shifted. He was no longer just surviving, he was becoming a symbol of defiance against the corruption that held them all. Anna's eyes met his again, her lips forming the words, "You are not alone." and though no one else heard it, Malik carried it with him like armor. The hidden pit beneath Coldwater State Prison still throbbed with noise from the upset of Ethan Miller's humiliation, but Bradley, furious at losing control of his spectacle, refused to allow Malik Johnson to walk away with victory, and so he raised his voice to the gamblers and announced that the night's entertainment was far from over, declaring that more challengers would enter until Malik either collapsed or was carried out lifeless. The crowd erupted with approval, their thirst for blood outweighing their shock, and guards shoved open the heavy iron gates as the next opponent stepped into the ring, a wiry man with a shaved head and quick fists, his body scarred from years of street fighting. Malik, breathing steadily despite the bruises that bloomed across his body, adjusted his stance, his eyes calm, his spirit focused on the rhythm of survival. The man charged with flurries of strikes, but Malik moved like water, redirecting blows, countering with precision, and with one decisive kick, he sent his opponent crashing to the ground, unconscious, before he hit the floor. The gamblers cursed, others cheered, and Bradley gritted his teeth, waving for the next fighter. The second challenger was broader, a brawler with the strength of a bear, who tried to crush Malik with sheer weight, slamming him against the cage and swinging fists like sledgehammers, but Malik absorbed the pain and waited, his breath steady, until the man's energy faltered. And then Malik struck with surgical precision, his elbow driving into the man's ribs and his foot sweeping him to the ground where he lay groaning in defeat. Sweat dripped down Malik's face, blood trickled from his lip, but his calm demeanor never faltered, his posture unwavering as he faced the next gate opening. This time, two men entered at once, brothers from the East Wing who fought as a pair, circling Malik like wolves, striking from opposite sides. The crowd howled with delight as fists and feet flew in a storm of violence, and for the first time Malik staggered, absorbing heavy blows, yet he refused to fall, his training guiding him through the chaos, his mind disciplined, his strikes deliberate. With a burst of speed, he threw one brother into the cage wall, his bones crunching against steel, then turned to counter the other with a spinning strike that left him crumpled on the floor. 4 opponents had entered, and all 4 had fallen, yet Malik still stood, his chest heaving, his eyes steady, his calm strength terrifying Bradley, who realized that this fight was no longer entertainment but a revelation. The crowd, once divided, now leaned toward Malik, chanting his name, their voices rising in defiance of the Warden's intentions. Anna Carter, watching from above, clenched her fist as her eyes welled with determination, whispering to herself that Malik was more than a fighter, he was a man exposing the rot at the core of the prison. Bradley hissed at the Jensens, promising that the next challengers would break him, and he signaled for the gates again. The 5th fighter was different, a trained Muay Thai expert with deadly knees and elbows, his movements sharp and disciplined, his attacks cutting through the air with precision. The fight was brutal, Malik absorbing punishment, each strike sending pain searing through his body, but he endured, his eyes focused, his stance never wavering, and when the opening came, he countered with a devastating throw, slamming the fighter into the ground where he stayed down, clutching his shoulder. Bradley's face twisted with rage, for Malik was not only surviving, he was winning, and the gamblers now swarmed with bets in his favor, money flying through the air, the system Bradley had built starting to unravel as the spectacle slipped from his grasp. The 6th challenger entered, a familiar face that made Malik's breath hitch for the first time that night. His younger brother Jerome Johnson, dragged into the pit with shackles removed, his eyes wild with fear and anger, his voice trembling as he shouted, "You abandoned me, Malik! You left me in here while you lived free!" The crowd gasped at the revelation, their cheers turning into whispers of disbelief as Malik froze, his calm shaken not by fists but by blood. Jerome charged at him, fists flying, his words burning with bitterness, and Malik defended himself without striking back, his heart aching with every blow. "I never left you, Jerome," he pleaded between breaths. "I didn't know they had you, I swear, and I won't fight you." But Jerome screamed louder, accusing him, calling him a traitor, his fist striking Malik's ribs, his tears mixing with sweat, and the crowd roared for blood, blind to the tragedy unfolding before them. Ethan Miller, standing outside the cage with bruises still on his face, laughed cruelly, shouting, "Fight your brother, boy, or die like a coward." Malik's restraint, his refusal to strike Jerome, made the crowd restless, some booing, others shouting admiration. But Bradley's face lit with satisfaction, for he believed family would finally break Malik where fist could not. Yet, even as Jerome hammered against him, Malik stood firm, wrapping his arms around his brother in a hold not meant to hurt but to protect, whispering in his ear that he would not let this system turn them against each other, that he would fight for both of them, that no amount of cruelty would make him raise his hand against his own blood. Slowly, Jerome's strikes weakened, his sobs breaking through, his anger fading into exhaustion as he slumped against Malik, and the arena shifted once again, the crowd's murmurs swelling into something deeper, a recognition that Malik's strength was not just physical but moral, a power that no chain could bind. Bradley, furious at losing the spectacle once again, ordered another fighter to enter, but Malik held his brother close, his voice steady as he shouted for all to hear, "They cannot break me, and they will not turn me against my own." His words carried through the pit, echoing off the walls, and even some guards hesitated, their eyes shifting as though questioning their roles in the corruption. Malik knew the night was far from over, that Bradley and Ethan would never stop until he was destroyed. But as he stood there, battered, bleeding, and holding his brother, he also knew he had already won something greater, the respect of men who had long forgotten hope, and the chance to turn the system's cruelty against itself. The pit was no longer just a place of blood sport, but a theater of truth where secrets clawed their way into the open. And as Malik Johnson held his exhausted younger brother Jerome in his arms, the crowd roared not with joy, but with confusion, for they had expected betrayal, they had expected blood between siblings, but instead they witnessed an act of love and defiance that none of them had ever seen inside the walls of Coldwater State Prison. Bradley's fury was etched deep into his face as he barked orders for guards to separate the brothers, but Malik's grip did not loosen, and Jerome clung to him, sobbing that he had been manipulated, that Ethan and the Jensen family had told him Malik had abandoned him years ago, that they had whispered lies into his ear until hatred replaced memory, and now confronted with his brother's embrace, he realized he had been used as a pawn in a corrupt game that had always wanted to see the Johnson family destroyed. The crowd failed to hush murmurs as Jerome's voice cracked, the words spilling out in raw anguish. "They told me you left me to rot, Malik. They told me you knew I was here and did nothing. But I see now they fed me poison. They made me hate you when you were the only one who ever loved me." Malik held him tighter, whispering for him to stay strong, for them to stand together against the machine that had tried to break them both. Ethan Miller, leaning against the bars outside the cage, burst into cruel laughter, shouting that brothers fighting brothers was the best entertainment anyone could ask for, but his laughter faltered when he saw the shift in the crowd, saw the hardened faces of inmates turning from amusement to respect, their voices rising not for his taunts but for Malik's refusal to break. Anna Carter, her eyes blazing, shouted above the din, "The truth always comes out, Bradley. You can't bury family with lies." And her words echoed like thunder through the chamber, igniting cheers from gamblers who had begun to despise the corruption more than they loved the blood. Bradley's rage was boiling over now, his voice hoarse as he demanded new fighters to enter, desperate to drown out the revelation with more violence. But the moment had already changed, the power slipping from his grasp. Malik released Jerome gently, guiding him to the side of the cage where he would be safe, his voice steady as he told him, "Stand behind me now, little brother. They will not use you again." And Jerome nodded, his tear-streaked face hardened with resolve as he finally saw who the real enemy was. The next challenger stormed into the cage, a brutal man with scars across his chest and a jagged blade hidden in his hand, clearly planted by Bradley to end Malik once and for all. But Malik's calm focus did not waver, his stance fluid, his eyes sharp, and when the man lunged with a slash, Malik deflected the attack with a precision born of discipline, disarming him with a twisting motion and sending him crashing to the floor unconscious. The crowd roared, not for the fall of another man, but for Malik's unshakable spirit, for his ability to withstand corruption and still hold onto dignity. And whispers of his name spread like wildfire, Malik Johnson becoming more than an inmate, becoming a symbol of hope. Bradley clenched his fists, turning to the Jensens with panic in his eyes, muttering that if Malik survived much longer he would spark something that could not be contained, that the prisoners would rally behind him and undo years of control built on fear and brutality. Ethan, his pride already shattered by Malik's earlier restraint, sneered and shouted, "You think you're a hero, boy? You think anyone cares? You're still a caged animal, and I'll make sure you die like one." Malik turned his gaze on him, calm and unwavering, and replied, "The only animal here is the one who feeds on hate. And when this night ends, the whole prison will see which of us truly stands." The crowd erupted with chants of Malik's name, their voices thundering louder than Bradley's desperate attempts to silence them. And for the first time in years, the balance of power shifted inside the prison walls, not with violence alone, but with truth. Jerome, still trembling, shouted across the pit for all to hear that Bradley and the Jensen family had orchestrated everything, that they had lied to him about Malik, that they had turned brother against brother for profit. And though the guards tried to drag him away, his words had already pierced the air, planting seeds of rebellion in the hearts of the men who listened. Malik stood in the center of the cage, battered, bloodied, yet unbroken, his chest heaving as he raised his voice above the chaos. "They want us divided, they want us broken, but we are stronger than their lies, stronger than their chains. And tonight I will show them that no system built on hate can destroy a man who refuses to bow." His words rolled through the pit like a battle cry, and the men in the crowd, once passive spectators, now pounded on the fences, their voices joining in a rhythm of defiance that no warden could ignore. The cage reeked of sweat, blood, and the electric tension of men who had seen a night transform from mere gambling spectacle into something closer to rebellion. And as Malik Johnson stood with his brother Jerome at his back, the echoes of the crowd's chants rattled Bradley's nerves, for never before had he witnessed the balance of power tilt so sharply away from his control. Ethan Miller had stormed into the cage with rage etched across his pale face, his pride shattered by Malik's earlier restraint, and his humiliation sharpened by the crowd now chanting the black man's name instead of his. But before Ethan could launch himself again, Bradley raised a hand and signaled to one of his most loyal enforcers, a towering inmate named Marcus Tate, a man who had once promised Malik his help in the yard, but whose true allegiance had always been to the warden's pocket. The betrayal was subtle at first, Marcus pretending to support Malik by circling Ethan from behind, but Malik's instincts felt the shift in energy, the tension of someone stalking him instead of defending him, and when Marcus's fist came flying toward his ribs, Malik twisted just in time to absorb the blow without collapsing. The crowd gasped, confused by the sudden attack, and Anna Carter rose from her seat above, her voice sharp with fury as she screamed, "He's supposed to be your ally! Don't you see what Bradley is doing?" The gamblers roared, some jeering with excitement at the chaos, others booing the clear manipulation, and Bradley's smug smile returned, for betrayal was his favorite weapon, one that cut deeper than fists. Ethan laughed cruelly, circling with Marcus as if they were wolves finally cornering their prey, and he spat, "Even your own so-called allies know you can't win, boy. Nobody stands with you. Not really." Malik steadied his breath, his calm returning like armor even as blood trickled down his lip, and he replied in a low voice that carried across the pit, "A man who sells his soul for scraps was never an ally, and a man who stands for truth cannot be broken by lies." His words burned Marcus, but the enforcer attacked anyway, swinging heavy punches while Ethan darted in with jabs and kicks, the two men trying to overwhelm Malik from both sides. Pain seared through Malik's body as blows landed, his ribs aching, his muscles screaming, but his discipline guided him, his training reminding him to flow around their aggression instead of meeting it head on. He redirected Marcus's momentum, using the man's own weight against him, and slammed him into Ethan with a precision born of experience, sending both men staggering. The crowd erupted, half in cheers, half in outrage, and Jerome shouted encouragement from the edge of the cage, his voice raw with desperation as he screamed, "Don't let them break you, Malik. You've carried me all my life. Carry this too." Malik absorbed the words like fuel, standing taller despite his exhaustion, his eyes blazing with a calm fire that unsettled Ethan more than any strike could. Bradley, sensing the danger of losing the narrative again, leaned toward the Jensens and hissed, "This cannot go on much longer. If he keeps surviving, the men will start believing he's untouchable, and once that happens, we can't control them." The Jensens growled, demanding more fighters, more weapons, anything to crush Malik before the night became a symbol of resistance. But Malik was already dismantling their plan piece by piece. Marcus lunged again, roaring with fury at being exposed as a traitor, but Malik sidestepped and caught him in a chokehold, whispering in his ear just loud enough for the crowd to hear, "Betrayal is the coward's legacy. and you will fall like every coward before you." With a twist of his arm and a strike to Marcus's throat, Malik sent the man crashing to the ground unconscious. His betrayal ended not with glory but with shame. The crowd roared again, some chanting Malik's name, others screaming for Ethan to finish him, and Ethan, humiliated beyond measure, charged with wild abandon, his punches sloppy, his kicks desperate. But Malik met him with calm precision, blocking, redirecting, countering until Ethan stumbled back, his breath ragged, his face twisted with panic. Malik did not finish him with brutality. Instead, he struck just enough to drop him to his knees, forcing Ethan to look up at the man he had tried to humiliate, the man who now stood as living proof that dignity could not be broken by hate. "You've lost already," Malik said quietly, his voice steady despite the blood on his lips. "Not because I beat you, but because I never became you." The words sank into Ethan like poison, and his scream of rage echoed as he collapsed against the cage. Defeated again, his pride shattered beyond repair. The betrayal of Marcus had failed, the humiliation of Ethan was complete, and Bradley's face had turned pale with fury as he realized that no matter how many tricks he played, Malik's calm strength was undoing his empire in front of everyone's eyes. Anna's voice rose again, her words sharp as knives as she shouted, "You can't hide behind corruption forever, Bradley. The world will know what happens here." And for the first time, even some of the guards shifted uneasily, their eyes betraying cracks in their loyalty as they saw the tide turning. Malik stood at the center of the cage, his chest heaving, his body battered, but his spirit towering over the corruption that surrounded him, and the chants of his name grew louder, shaking the walls of the underground pit. The air inside the underground pit had grown heavy with the weight of betrayal, revelation, and defiance. And as Malik Johnson stood victorious over Marcus Tate's unconscious body and Ethan Miller's broken pride, the crowd's chants reached a fever pitch, their voices echoing through the iron rafters like a storm that even Warden Bradley could not silence. The gamblers who once jeered for Malik's death now roared for his survival, and even hardened guards exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing that what they were witnessing was no longer just a fight but a rebellion of spirit unfolding in plain view. Bradley's face burned red with rage. His jaw clenched so tightly the veins in his neck bulged, and he slammed his fist against the railing as he shouted to the Jensens that Malik could not be allowed to walk out of the pit alive, that if he did, their entire empire of fear and profit would collapse. The Jensens, pale with fury, demanded that Bradley unleash the final weapon, the fight that would crush Malik once and for all and erase the chants that had already begun to rattle their power. Bradley signaled to the guards, and the heavy gate screeched open one last time, revealing the opponent they had held back for the finale. A fighter trained in secret, a hulking brute named Donovan Cole who had been promised freedom if he destroyed Malik in front of everyone. Donovan stepped into the cage with eyes cold and dead, his fists wrapped in steel-tipped gloves smuggled in under Bradley's orders, and the crowd gasped at the sight, understanding that this was no fair fight but an execution disguised as entertainment. Malik's body ached with every movement, his ribs sore, his muscles screaming from the endless battles, yet his calm focus remained unbroken, his eyes locked on Donovan with a steady determination that radiated strength, even as his body trembled with exhaustion. Jerome shouted from the edge of the cage, his voice raw with desperation, telling Malik he did not need to prove anything else. But Malik lifted a hand gently, his voice calm as he said, "This is the last storm, brother, and I will stand through it." Ethan Miller, still slumped against the bars with blood on his face, laughed bitterly through broken teeth, sneering that no man could survive Donovan. But his words carried no weight now, drowned out by the thunder of voices chanting Malik's name. Donovan charged forward with terrifying speed for his size, fists swinging with lethal intent, and Malik barely dodged, the wind of the blow brushing his cheek, the crowd screaming as steel scraped against steel bars behind him. Malik's calm discipline guided him, each breath controlled, each movement precise, his body flowing like water around Donovan's brute force, redirecting his momentum, striking only when necessary. The clash was brutal, Donovan's fists slamming into Malik's arms and shoulders, each impact jolting through his bones. But Malik refused to fall, his focus sharper with each passing second. Anna Carter shouted from above, her voice carrying across the pit, "He is not fighting just for himself, he is fighting for all of you." and the words ignited the crowd into chants of unity, their fists pounding against the fences, their voices rising until it felt as though the walls themselves might collapse. Bradley screamed at Donovan to finish Malik, his voice shrill with desperation. But Donovan was beginning to falter, his strikes less precise, his breath heavy, his body weighed down by the steel on his fists and the endless pressure of Malik's unbroken calm. Malik waited, watching, his eyes narrowing as he saw the opening, and with a sudden burst of speed, he struck Donovan's wrist, sending one steel glove clattering to the floor, and then drove a kick into his ribs that made the giant stagger back in shock. The crowd erupted, gamblers throwing slips of paper into the air, their cries for Malik now louder than Bradley's desperate commands. Donovan roared with rage and lunged again, his massive arms wrapping around Malik in a crushing bear hug. Lifting him off the ground as the air was squeezed from his lungs, the crowd screaming in horror as Malik's face contorted with pain. Jerome shouted Malik's name, pounding against the bars. Anna screamed for him to fight, and Bradley leaned forward with a gleam of triumph, certain that at last Malik would be broken. But even in the crushing grip, Malik's mind remained calm, his training guiding him, his body shifting just enough to free one arm, and with precision he struck Donovan's throat, forcing the brute to release him with a choking gasp. Malik landed on his feet, his chest heaving, his body shaking, but his eyes burning with unshakable resolve. Donovan stumbled back, clutching his throat, and Malik advanced slowly, the crowd's chants shaking the very air, and with one final strike, a devastating spinning kick, Malik sent Donovan crashing to the floor, the giant's body collapsing in a heap of defeat. The silence that followed was deafening, the crowd holding its breath, and then the explosion of cheers shook the pit like an earthquake. Prisoners and gamblers and even some guards chanting Malik's name as he stood tall, battered but unbroken, the last man standing. Bradley screamed in fury, his voice drowned out by the chants, his empire of fear unraveling before his eyes. The Jensen storming away in rage as they realized the tide had turned. Ethan, broken and humiliated, watched in horror as Malik raised his fist, not in victory for himself, but as a symbol for every man who had ever been crushed by the system, his calm strength now transformed into a beacon that no corruption could silence. Malik turned to Jerome, his voice steady despite the blood in his mouth, and said, "We are not their slaves, we are not their entertainment, we are men. And tonight, we proved it." The crowd thundered in agreement, their voices uniting in chants of freedom, their fists pounding the bars in rhythm. And for the first time, the walls of Coldwater trembled not with fear, but with the echo of defiance. The underground pit lay in ruins of sound and fury, gamblers scattering their torn slips, prisoners pounding the bars until their knuckles bled, and guards frozen in disbelief as Malik Johnson stood alone in the center, battered and bloodied, yet unbroken, the last man standing after a night meant to destroy him. Donovan Cole, the Warden's final weapon, lay motionless at his feet. Ethan Miller cowered against the bars, and Marcus Tate's betrayal had ended in unconscious shame. And for the first time in years, the prison was alive, not with fear, but with the rhythm of resistance. The name Malik chanted louder than the clang of steel or the bark of guards. Warden Bradley shouted himself hoarse from the gallery, his voice breaking as he demanded order, demanded silence, demanded that his empire of gambling and cruelty continue, but no one listened. Not the gamblers who now saw their fortunes lost, not the guards whose eyes flickered with doubt, and not the prisoners who had tasted the first breath of hope. The Jensens stormed out in rage, their money bleeding into the dust, their promises of power slipping away, and Bradley knew with each chant of Malik's name his own authority was collapsing into rubble. Malik raised his fist, not in triumph for blood spilled, but as a symbol that dignity could not be caged, that justice could live even in chains, and his voice cut through the chaos with the clarity of truth as he said, "They tried to use me as entertainment. They tried to make me fight my own brother. They tried to break me with betrayal and lies. But tonight we showed them something stronger than hate. We showed them that even in chains, we still have choice. Even in darkness, we still have light." The crowd of inmates roared, their voices uniting, their fists slamming the bars in rhythm, and the guards who once enforced Bradley's commands now looked at each other uncertainly, their obedience faltering as the tide of defiance swelled louder than the warden's authority. Jerome clung to the edge of the cage, tears streaming down his face, shouting to Malik that he had never abandoned him. that together they would survive. And Anna Carter, standing high above with fire in her eyes, shouted to anyone who could hear that the world outside would learn the truth of Coldwater's corruption, that Malik Johnson's name would not be buried in silence. Ethan Miller, broken and humiliated, crawled across the floor, his pride shattered beyond repair. And when his eyes met Malik's, he saw not hatred but calm pity, a reminder that Malik's strength had never come from cruelty, but from the discipline to remain whole when others tried to shatter him. Malik turned away from Ethan, showing the crowd that vengeance was not his purpose, that justice was bigger than bruises and scars. And with each step he took, the chants grew louder, transforming into a roar that shook the very foundation of the prison. Bradley screamed for his guards to end it, to drag Malik down. But hesitation rippled through their ranks, some lowering their batons, others stepping back, their loyalty collapsing as they realized the man before them had already won more than any cage fight could measure. Malik's body trembled from exhaustion, blood staining his shirt, but his spirit stood taller than the walls built to contain him, and his words rang out one final time. "You can cage my body, but you cannot cage the truth. And the truth is this: a man who bows to hate is already defeated, but a man who stands for dignity will never fall." Silence followed for a heartbeat, the weight of his message sinking into every ear, and then the explosion of sound that followed felt like freedom. A sound louder than Bradley's fury, louder than the rattling bars, a sound that marked the birth of a legend. Malik knelt briefly beside Jerome, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder, whispering that their fight was not over, that the system would keep trying to break them, but that as long as they remembered who they were, they would never be truly defeated. Jerome nodded through tears, his heart swelling with pride as he realized the brother he once hated had just shown him what it meant to carry strength without cruelty. Anna's eyes glistened with conviction as she turned to leave, already planning how she would spread the truth beyond these walls, how she would make sure that Malik's story was not silenced but amplified until the corruption-rotting Coldwater was dragged into the light. Bradley slumped into his chair, pale and trembling, his empire crumbling before him, his legacy reduced to the echoes of a night he could not control. And he understood too late that fear built on lies could never outlast the calm strength of truth. Malik stood one final time at the center of the cage, his body scarred, his chains still clinking, but his spirit radiant with victory. And the crowd of men who had once been prisoners of fear now looked at him as a symbol of defiance, chanting his name with a unity that no wall could contain. The lights above flickered, the chants shook the rafters, and for one night in the heart of a corrupt prison, justice had been reborn, not through the hands of the powerful, but through the dignity of a man who refused to bow. The end. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I'd love to know what you think about the twist in Malik's journey. Did the ending surprise you, or did you see it coming? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because your perspective makes this channel stronger every time you share it.